given how dynamic and powerful both of these individuals are, I have seated them with each other on that side, and I am on this side. Really, I want to step back from the conversation. I've told both Manish and Dilip to really take this conversation over. And Manish turned to Dilip and said, "You do the poetry and I'll do the plumbing." So, building on the toilet training session, of course. So this is a huge issue, and we really can't make jest of how we're going to solve this problem. We did a little bit of research to be able to frame this issue, and through it realized that India is playing a critical role in skills development. I'm not going to talk too much. I really want to hand it over to our poet, Dilip, who's really going to help sort of frame the issue, and then we'll have a conversation between the two.
Thanks, Neera. It's typical of Manish to give the guy who's the least articulate the designation of being the poet. But I'll try and actually set the context on what the challenge is. By 2022, and a lot of people have asked this question, why 2022? It just happens to be 75 years of Indian independence. So what would India be at 75? You would have close to, given the worker participation rates, you would have close to 700 million people in the working population. I mean, these people not working age, but these will be actually in the workforce. Out of them, if we do everything right in the higher education and education space, 200 million would be graduates. So that leaves 500 million people who have dropped out of various stages of schooling or college. And therefore, what skills or how employable or what would these people do? There are two challenges. The first is that if these people don't have any skills, then rather than contributing to productivity, they would engage in other activities which would actually bring economic activity to much reduced levels than we are seeing. If we have them skilled and don't have jobs, we have another problem. So if you look at the, enhancing youth employability in India is actually a three-track process. One, we got to ensure economic growth going forward. And second, we have the agenda to deal with the transition of addressing the issues in the 200 million that are currently enrolled in school, go through school, get into college. How do we address the whole quality and employability issue in that? And the second is the transformational agenda, where we have to see what we can do for the 500 million people who would be without any particular skill and be in the workforce at that point of time. So that's the challenge. Now what's happening? There are multiple things happening. There's right to education. There's the higher vocationalization of school education, may be good or bad. Let's not get into that. And then I think the biggest piece and what would be interest to everybody here is that the government believes that this could actually be done in a sustainable manner by private sector through interventions by private sector in terms of contributing to the growth and development of, let's say, these 500 million people. In the first session, you actually heard a very interesting thing of, directed funding, moving away from grants to sustainable models. And that's what the impact is trying to be got in this sector. So the NSDC is an experiment. It's perhaps one of the largest experiments anywhere in the world. We have a small target of skilling 150 million people between last year or 2008 and 2022, but we are officially launched at the end of 2009. And the interesting thing is that there's a National Skill Development Fund which has been created. And the fund is supposed to attract government, private sector, multilateral, bilateral funding to actually help skill people going forward. And rather than set up a parallel organization going forward, what NSDC has actually done is reached out to social entrepreneurs and take them and get them to set up scalable, sustainable skill development initiatives going forward. And scalable means at least 100,000 people over 10 years. That's the first challenge. The NGO sector or the other sector is more importantly spending a lot of their time chasing money rather than scaling up projects. So we said you do 100,000 people over 10 years, we'll guarantee you 10-year funding, but based on annual milestones. The second is that 70% of them need to have a livelihood. That means they need to be either get become entrepreneurs or get a job. And the third, and this is very interesting, is got to be sustainable. And the fourth element, we're saying that there should be an independent body that certifies these people that they can have fungible across industries, across different types of geographies, etc. So that's what the idea of doing what we are trying to do in NSDC. Now, if you look at what are some of the things that are actually impeding this, what we find is there's a new role for organizations, many of you who are present in this room, to be able to move what are typically grant-based organizations to sustainable organizations. I'm sure Manish, when he talks about it, will talk about who pays. So the question is who pays? The way we are looking at it is if there's value in something, then everybody along the chain recognizes the value and pays for it. And free programs don't get value. And I think Dasra had done something very interesting, and they had, I think, if I can just refer to the report, there's the copies at the back, and they had actually looked at the whole value chain of skill development and said where interventions could actually help this make it sustainable. So there's a real opportunity for all of us to actually work together and address it. You have to address the aspirational challenge. People are not willing to get skilled to get a job because we've not been able to excite that. The only industry perhaps that's been able to excite people to get a job is the IT industry. So people will queue up whether they have talent or don't have talent to get into the IT industry. So I think if you look at the overall framework, there is a challenge of, I was very interested in the first session of creating networks when Jan talked about it, because the government is also trying to create a network, because there are 17 to 23 ministries and 28 states that are involved in skill development, and maybe, I heard the figure 3.1 million NGOs in the country. So how do you get a collaborative effort going, and how do you get everybody to align in one direction? And that's what the government is trying to do with the Prime Minister's Skills Council. They've got Mr. Ramadurai as the advisor, the NSDC to try and get the private sector together. So that's what the overall challenge is. I'll leave it to Manish to actually tell you more about it, and then
okay. Thanks, Dilip. So I work for a people supply chain company. We've hired somebody every 5 minutes for the last 5 years, but we've only hired 5% of the kids who came to us for a job. So I'm sort of at the agony and ecstasy of India's labor market. The ecstasy is obvious to everybody. Companies just can't find employees. So I had a telecom client shouting at me a few days ago saying, I need 500 salespeople, why aren't you filling them up? I said, well, your hiring standards are too high. So he called me back after an hour and said, I need a pair of hands. I don't care if a brain comes attached. And we did that pretty quickly. But the agony is what is more sort of troubling to me. We had a job fair in Rajasthan where 35,000 people showed up in one day. And I met 800 of those kids personally. And I can guarantee if they were born in Bombay, Delhi, or Bangalore, most of those kids would have had a job. But unfortunately, they're born in Dausa or Barmer or Jhunjhunu or Ajmer or whatever. So, the two most important decisions that a child in India makes are to choose your parents wisely and to choose your PIN code wisely. It wasn't as obvious to me. I chose my parents and my PIN code wisely. But, the fact that I send 35,000 kids home every month, we hire 3,000, 4,000 of them, but I send 35,000 kids and the binary outcome is sort of a problem. And we are a child of sort of low hiring standards, but there are 5 transitions happening in India's labor market. It's farm to non-farm, rural to urban, unorganized to organized, subsistence self-employment to wage employment, and school to work. And I think all those 5 transitions are obvious to most of you. Farm to non-farm is, 58% of our people produce 15% of our GDP. We became the largest producer of milk in the world last year. We produced 120 million tons of milk. But 75 million people did that. The US produces 60 million tons of milk with 100,000 people. So these 75 million people aren't employed, they're hanging out. Most importantly, they're condemned to poverty. The rural to urban is very complex because of the geography of work. We only have 34 cities in India with more than 1 million people. China has 200 cities. Job creation tends to cluster. So we have 600,000 villages, but 200,000 of those villages have less than 200 people. So how do you create an economic cluster with less than 200 people? The self-employment to wage employment is important because 50% of India is self-employed. That's not a badge of an overweighted entrepreneurial gene among Indians. The poor cannot afford to be unemployed, so they're self-employed. The school to work is a challenge. 1 million people will join 1 million kids will join the labor force every month for the next 20 years. That is the demographic difference. 1 million every month for 20 years. So that school to work transition isn't really working right now. And formal to informal, 93% of India is informally employed. That was exactly the same number in 1991. Why have we not been able, why has 100% of net job creation in the last 20 years happened in the informal sector? So these three problems, of these 5 transitions, are basically because of 3 problems. There's a matching problem, which is connecting demand to supply. There's a mismatch problem, which is repairing supply for demand. And there's a pipeline problem, which is preparing supply for demand. And things should prepare by duration or by the opening balance of the kid. But I think the challenge really is there's a massive difference between the size of the problem and the scale of the solution currently proposed. As an entrepreneur, there are 2 kinds of companies you can create, a baby and a dwarf. A baby and a dwarf are both small, but one is going to grow and one is going to stay there. The difference between a baby and a dwarf is not more food. It's not more money. It is really in DNA of the organization. And we've thrown a lot of money at the problem, and we will continue. In the 11th plan, we're going to raise the substantial hike in the 12th plan, but it's not more cooks in the kitchen. It's a different recipe. So the scale is a very important part of the India problem. In the National Skill Mission, I'm sick and tired of presentations from popcorn stands like New Zealand and Singapore and Germany. Their entire output is going to be a pilot for our apprenticeship program. So and they do a wonderful job of it. And an output, a German apprentice is an IIT engineer quality or close, but it's not something we can afford. Cost, quality, and scale. I went to Wharton, I paid 15,000 rupees an hour. ISB is about 10,000 rupees an hour. IIMs are about 7,000 rupees an hour. IITs are about 3,000 rupees an hour. We have to do this at 200 rupees an hour. So, my biggest argument right now, we're doing a joint venture with Singapore for hospitality in the Singapore vocational training system, and we just can't agree on how much money to spend because they want to build the Shangri-La, and if you build the Shangri-La, you can't do it at 200 rupees a square foot per person per hour. So I think that scale, cost, quality, scale being the impossible trinity is a very important plumbing and scaffolding challenge which we all have to confront. The important part is that it is a market failure in skills. See, employers are not willing to pay for training or candidates, but they're willing to pay for trained candidates. Candidates are not willing to pay for training, they're willing to pay for a job. Banks or microfinance aren't willing to lend to the candidate for training unless a job is guaranteed. So the innovation lies at the intersection of employment and employability. Your training has to become a job with fine print, because that's the only way you're going to be able to finance this. And if there is a market failure, how are we going to get the government to step in various ways? I know Dilip and me have a disagreement, but I don't think companies can manufacture their own employees. There are 3 holes in the bucket. You pay for training, the kid doesn't get a job. You pay for training, the kid gets a job, but is not productive. You pay for training, the kid gets a job, is productive, but he leaves. So we can do apprenticeship programs, we can reimburse kids if they stay with us, but we can't manufacture our own employees. And if the government has to step in, the government is organized vertically. You have an Ayatollah of labor, an Ayatollah of HR, but the solution is a horizontal. And it's an intersection problem, state versus center, 2 human capital ministries versus 19 other ministries, certification versus delivery, financing versus delivery. So we have a traffic jam at the intersection, which is a challenge right now. The important other challenge really is the difference between education and training in the cerebral cortex of the education ayatollahs, where there's a caste system. I was talking about learning for earning in a conference recently, and the vice chancellor of Gujarat University got up and said, it's people like you who are spoiling higher education. Learning is not for earning, learning is for living. I don't even know what that means, but my point was that I can teach somebody in 6 months to be a barbender, a mason, a customer service person, and a salesperson, but I can't teach him to be creative, confident, curious, risk-taker team player. You had him for 12 years or 15 years before I did. I can repair. Repair is an emergency triage. We cannot teach in repair what you had to do in Prepare. So I think that artificial partition between training and vocation and education is obviously going to have to go away. The challenge, and I'll probably stop here, is the three deficits. The government has an execution deficit. You know, the private sector has a trust deficit. And the NGO sector has a scale deficit. It's not an aspiration deficit. All of you talk about doing things at big scale, but I've tried to work with many of them, and we're just not able to get to the 5, 10,000, 15,000 a month for whatever reason. And we obviously have a trust deficit. Many people in the private sector have earned it. Many people in the private sector hopefully have not earned it. But we have a problem right now where there's an intersection of and that's leading to a solution which is subscale. In some cases, you're scaling, but you're not leading to quality. You know, you just, in vocational training, you have to have a binary outcome. It either leads for, unlike education, where you can get away with telling stories about learning outcomes and parents who didn't speak English and stuff. In vocational training, it either led to a job or didn't lead to a job, so there's no way really to hide in this. But so I think what we need to figure out is how to get all three people working together, because the government is spending money but doing it badly so outlays aren't leading to outcomes. The private sector is not able to convince crack the who pays problem. And the skill and the funding available in the philanthropy sector hasn't been able to sort of work its way to a 1 million sort of level of a single project or even 500,000. And public policy is an important part of this. See, the only thing that stands between me and 1 million employees is public policy. And I spend 30% of my time on public policy because of that. But you know, the biggest question I have after 3 years of doing that is how do you get something done in government when everybody who matters in government agrees with you? You've got to think about that a while. When I was younger, I didn't have access and I thought they disagreed with me. Now I'm on the Prime Minister's Skill Council and they completely agree with me, but we haven't been able to get much done on the policy side. But there is a number of statistically independent tries happening right now, and this is, nobody's seen this movie before. Nobody has done it at 200 rupees an hour in 1,000 cities at India, at the quality that leads to a job. And this is the biggest entrepreneurial opportunity on the planet in the next 20 years. I mean, there's no question about that 80 or 90% of India's skill infrastructure has not been built yet. And NSDC is an important part of that, but obviously philanthropy is an important part of that.
So I think you've both given us a great sense of the problem, but can we shift a little bit to the hope side? From the state.
You know, it's fascinating. You know, how many of you actually in the audience think I'm from government after this discussion? Can I see the hands, please? Only 3, that's good. I thought all hands would go up. You know, I'm actually from the private sector, right? And we are trying to find a solution to this. And the biggest block to the entire solution is actually very interesting. Manish would like somebody else to pay for training. He doesn't want to go and create a value proposition. Not him, but I mean, people who are service providers and skill would like to get someone else to pay for the training and not try and create a value proposition across the value chain. Sorry, so Manish would actually go and get someone else to pay for the training. So we want to be a service delivery model. So the government will pay for someone to be trained. And the